Neighbors called it crazy the day she hauled the first bucket of mud across the dry yard, her boots sinking deep into the clay as if the earth itself was trying to pull her back. They leaned on fence posts and porch rails, shaking their heads in the slow, certain way people do when they believe they are witnessing a mistake. $4 was all she had spent so far, and even that had been for nails and a second-hand shovel. Everything else came from the land: dirt, water, straw, sweat. They laughed and said a woman could not build a fortress out of mud. They laughed even harder when she said that was exactly what she intended to do. The land sat at the edge of town where the dust rose in soft clouds whenever a wagon rolled by. The houses nearby were wooden, painted in fading whites and blues, with porches that creaked and roofs that groaned in summer heat. Her patch of ground looked smaller than it was, ringed by scrub brush and cracked earth. No trees shaded it, no creek ran through it. It was the sort of place folks bought cheap when they had no better choice. She had come there with one trunk, a cast-iron skillet, and a stubborn look that had already begun to harden into something stronger. People said she had lost her senses after her husband passed. They said grief could twist a mind. They said no one in their right mind would leave a proper house in town to live in a patch of dirt with no boards, no bricks, and no money. But they did not know what she knew about walls that crumble and roofs that leak and promises that do not last. On the first morning, she knelt in the dirt and pressed her palm into the ground. The soil was thick and heavy, dark where it held moisture beneath the top crust. She smiled to herself. Clay, the kind that holds shape when you squeeze it tight. The kind that dries hard as stone if you give it time and patience. She had seen buildings like that once long ago, out west where the wind carved mountains and houses grew from the ground itself. She remembered how cool they felt inside, how solid the walls seemed, how quiet the rooms stayed even when storms roared. She began with a circle. Folks from the neighboring farms gathered that evening to watch her mark it out with a stick tied to a length of twine. She paced it carefully, measuring with steps and counting under her breath. The circle was wide enough for a single large room, maybe two if she chose to divide it later. One man muttered that she was building a pen for goats. Another said it would wash away with the first hard rain. A woman from 2 lots down crossed her arms and whispered that pride was a dangerous thing in a widow. She did not answer them. She dug. The shovel bit into the earth with a steady rhythm. Morning to dusk, she carved a shallow trench along the line of her circle. She mixed clay with water in a wooden trough she had found behind the old general store. She cut straw from a nearby field with permission from a farmer who did not believe she would get far enough to need more. Then she stomped the mixture with her bare feet, pressing it together until it formed thick, heavy mud. It clung to her skirts and dried in patches on her sleeves. By sunset her hands were blistered, her back sore, but her eyes shone with a quiet fire. By the third day, children from town began sneaking out to watch. They perched on a low fence and stared as she shaped the mud into thick blocks, stacking them one by one along the trench. She pressed each block firm against the next, smoothing the seams with her fingers. The wall rose slowly, no higher than her knee at first. It looked uneven and crude. The laughter grew louder. They called it her mud castle. They said she had read too many adventure stories. They said she thought she was living in some old American tale where pioneers built homes with their bare hands and survived on grit alone. Maybe she had. Maybe she believed that story more than the one people tried to tell about her. When the sun dipped low, she stayed outside long after the others had gone in for supper. She studied the curve of the wall, adjusting here and there, filling cracks before they could deepen. She understood something her neighbors did not. Mud, when treated right, becomes stronger each day. It bonds with itself. It grows solid with time. Wood rots, nails rust. But earth, when shaped and cared for, returns to its hardest form. As the weeks passed, the circle grew taller. She left a gap for a doorway wide enough to stand proud in. She shaped the top into a gentle arch, pressing handfuls of clay into a smooth curve. She carved small square openings near the upper rim, no bigger than a book, to let light and air slip inside. The structure began to resemble something ancient and strong, more fortress than cottage. The walls thickened until they were nearly as wide as her outstretched arms. She worked in layers, letting one dry before adding another. The talk in town shifted from laughter to concern. Some worried the wall would collapse and crush her. Others muttered that she was shaming herself. A few, very few, began to wonder if she might succeed, but no one offered help. Pride runs deep in small towns, and so does fear of looking foolish. She kept a small notebook tucked in her apron pocket. In it, she sketched ideas for shelves carved straight into the walls. She planned a raised platform along one side for a bed. She imagined a hearth built from river stones she had gathered one bucket at a time. Every idea was careful, practical, and tied to the land. She did not want a house that depended on a lumber yard or a train shipment. She wanted something that would stand even if the world forgot her. By late summer, the mud fortress stood taller than any of the nearby fences. Its curved walls cast a round shadow at midday. The surface had dried into a web of fine cracks, each one smoothed over with fresh clay until the outer layer looked like thick leather stretched tight. From a distance, it appeared carved from a single mound of earth. The day she set the door frame in place, the whole town seemed to know. She had salvaged the wood from an abandoned barn, sanding it smooth and fitting it carefully into the opening. The arch above it held firm, not a single block shifted. She stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow, and allowed herself a small nod. One of the neighbors approached then, a man who had mocked her the loudest at the start. He circled the structure slowly, touching the wall with the back of his hand. It felt cool despite the heat. He knocked against it. The sound was dull and solid. He said nothing, but the smirk he once wore was gone. Inside, the air was different. The thick mud walls kept out the harshest glare of the sun. Light filtered through the small openings near the top, falling in soft beams that shifted through the day. The space smelled of earth and straw, simple and clean. She stood in the center, hands on her hips, and felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. Still, whispers followed her to the well and the market. They said winter would break it. They said the first heavy storm would turn it back to a pile of sludge. They said she would come begging for a spare room before the year was done. She listened and kept working. She coated the exterior with a final layer mixed finer than the rest, smoothing it with long strokes until it shone faintly in the sun. She built a small overhang above the door to keep rain from running straight down the frame. She lined the base with stones to prevent erosion. Every choice came from observation and memory. She had learned from watching fields flood and barns lean. She had learned that strength lies in details. The cost never rose beyond those first $4. The land provided the clay, the field provided the straw. The abandoned barn offered wood no one else wanted. Even the stones came from a dry riverbed where they lay forgotten. People began to repeat the number in disbelief, $4. Less than the price of a new coat? Less than a month's worth of groceries? They had spent more laughing at her than she had spent building the walls. Autumn arrived with sharp wings that swept across the plains. Leaves from distant trees skittered past her round fortress, catching at the base before blowing free. The walls held steady. She lit a small fire in the hearth she had finished just days before. Smoke curled upward and drifted out through a narrow vent she had shaped into the roofline. Inside, the warmth settled evenly, trapped by the thick mud that absorbed heat and released it slowly. For the first time, a few neighbors stepped through the doorway. They removed their hats out of habit, glancing around with quiet surprise. The interior felt solid and safe, like the inside of a hill. Shelves carved into the walls held jars of beans and dried herbs. A simple wooden table stood near the center. The bed platform was covered with a quilt stitched from old dresses. It was not grand, but it was steady. They walked back outside with new expressions on their faces. Word spread quickly. The mud fortress did not look like folly anymore. It looked like something else. Something deliberate, something that might last. Then came the first storm of the season. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, thick and heavy. The wind howled across the fields, bending fence posts and rattling shutters. Rain began as a whisper and grew into a pounding roar. Neighbors hurried to secure their barns and shut their windows tight. Some cast uneasy glances toward the round structure at the edge of town. She stood inside her fortress, one hand resting against the curved wall. The rain struck the exterior in sheets. Water ran down the surface, pooling briefly at the base before slipping away along the stones she had placed. The wind pushed hard against the door, but the frame held. The small upper openings let in flashes of lightning, quick bursts of white that illuminated the room. Hours passed. The storm did not ease. Outside, a loud crack echoed through the night as one of the older wooden houses lost part of its roof. Shingles tore free and vanished into the dark. A barn door slammed off its hinges. People shouted over the roar of wind, scrambling to protect what they could. And in the center of it all, the mud fortress stood unmoving. Morning crept in slow and gray. The rain softened to a drizzle. One by one, neighbors stepped out to assess the damage. Fences lay flat, branches littered yards. Pieces of roofing rested in muddy puddles. They turned their eyes toward the edge of town. The round walls rose from the wet earth, darker now but intact. Not a single section had collapsed. The arch over the door remained smooth and strong. Water beaded on the surface and slid away. Smoke drifted calmly from the vent as she boiled water inside for coffee. A small crowd gathered, silent this time. No one laughed, no one shook their head. She opened the door and stepped out, boots pressing into the softened ground. Her skirt brushed the curve of the wall as she looked at the damage around town. There was sympathy in her eyes, not triumph. But there was something else too, proof. Neighbors called it crazy when she began. They had counted her out before the first layer dried. They believed a mud house built for $4 could not stand against wind and rain. Now they stood staring at it, seeing not just a shelter, but the start of something they had never imagined. And as the morning sun pushed through the clouds, glinting off the damp earth walls, a question moved quietly through the crowd. If she could build this from dirt and willpower alone, what else might rise from that small patch of land? She looked past them toward the open field beyond her fortress, where the soil stretched wide in waiting. In her notebook, tucked once more into her apron, were sketches no one had seen yet, plans that reached higher than a single round room. Ideas that would change more than just her own life. She took a slow breath, studying the faces before her, and then turned back toward the doorway. Because the mud fortress was only the beginning. She stepped back inside and closed the door against the damp morning air. The inside still held warmth from the night fire. The walls felt steady beneath her palm, as if the earth itself had chosen to stand with her. Outside, voices drifted through the small openings near the roof. Curious, uneasy, changed. She poured coffee into a tin cup and sat at the rough wooden table she had shaped from barn planks. The notebook lay before her. Its pages were worn at the corners from being handled so often. She opened it slowly, running a finger over the pencil lines that mapped out more circles beside the first one. Larger ones? Smaller ones? A row of connected domes like a chain of hills rising from the ground. This land had once belonged to her father. Years ago, before hard seasons and bad debts forced him to sell it off piece by piece. She remembered standing beside him at the fence line, watching strangers hammer their own posts into soil that had carried her childhood footsteps. She remembered the shame in his silence more than any words he might have spoken. When she bought this small section back for almost nothing, people assumed it was sentiment. They did not know she was buying something unfinished. The fortress was not built from grief alone. It was built from memory. That afternoon, a wagon rolled slowly toward her land. She saw it through the narrow window and stepped outside. The wheels cut deep lines in the softened dirt. On the seat sat the same neighbor who had once mocked her the loudest. His hat rested low on his brow. He did not meet her eyes at first. He cleared his throat and glanced at the round walls behind her. He said his roof had suffered worse than he expected. Said he might need a place to store a few sacks of feed until he could patch it up. His voice carried none of its old sharpness. She studied him quietly. The wind tugged at her skirt. Finally she nodded and stepped aside. He unloaded the sacks and carried them inside. His boots echoed softly against the packed earth floor. He looked around once more, longer this time. He asked how she had learned to build like this. She answered simply that she had paid attention. To the land, to the way heat moved, to the way storms traveled. She did not speak of her father's fields or the long nights listening to rain against thin wooden walls. Some lessons are better shown than told. By evening others arrived. A woman whose kitchen wall had cracked during the storm came with a basket of bread and questions. A young man who dreamed of leaving town lingered near the door, studying the curve of the arch. Children pressed their hands against the cool surface, tracing the fine lines in the dried clay. The laughter was gone now. In its place sat curiosity, which can be far more powerful. Still, not everyone was impressed. At the general store, voices rose low and cautious. Some argued that mud could never replace proper lumber, that a town built of earth would look poor and backward. That pride was one thing, but change was another. They worried about property values, about outsiders judging them, about the way new ideas shift old balances. She heard the rumors but did not respond. She had not built the fortress to win favor. She had built it to prove something to herself. Winter crept closer with each passing week. The air sharpened at dusk, and frost began to cling to the edges of fields. Inside the mud fortress, warmth held steady long after the fire died down. The thick walls trapped heat in a way wooden boards never could. She began testing small changes, adding a layer of lime wash to one section, carving a deeper shelf into another. Each adjustment taught her something new. At night she wrote by lantern light. Not just sketches, but numbers, costs, time spent mixing clay. How long each layer needed to dry before it could carry more weight. She recorded how the wind struck the western side harder than the east. She measured the temperature difference between inside and out with a small thermometer she had purchased years ago and nearly forgotten. It was not just a house she was building. It was knowledge. One cold morning, she walked beyond her circle of land to the dry riverbed. She crouched and sifted through sand until she found stones smooth and flat. She loaded them into a sack and carried them home slowly, resting often. When she reached the fortress, she began laying them in a ring several feet away from the main wall. A second foundation. Neighbors noticed at once. They gathered again, this time without laughter but with furrowed brows. One asked if she planned to build another round room. Another wondered aloud how many such domes she thought she could raise before the novelty wore thin. She answered neither question directly. Instead, she spoke of insulation, of energy efficiency, of homes that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, without heavy reliance on wood. She spoke of affordable housing, though she did not use the term in any grand way. She simply said a person should not need a fortune to feel safe inside their own walls. The words lingered. A traveling preacher passed through town that same week. He stood near the well and spoke of endurance, of building one's life upon rock rather than sand. Some cast glances toward the mud fortress as he preached. They wondered what he would say if he saw it, whether he would call it folly or faith. She watched from a distance, arms folded loosely, saying nothing. Snow arrived early that year. It fell thick and quiet, covering fields in white. Wooden roofs creaked under its weight. Chimneys smoked heavily as families burned more wood to keep warm. The mud fortress, rounded and smooth, allowed snow to slide off its curved sides. Inside, the air remained steady, almost gentle. One evening, a knock sounded against her door. It was the woman with the cracked kitchen wall. Her cheeks were red from cold, her hands shaking slightly. She said her youngest child could not sleep from the draft that slipped through their boards. She asked, softly now, if it might be possible to patch their wall with mud the way the fortress walls had been layered. The request settled heavy in the space between them. She invited the woman inside and poured tea. They sat at the table and spoke of mixtures and ratios, of clay content and straw length. She explained how the outer layer must be finer to shed water, how thickness mattered more than beauty. The woman listened carefully, nodding with growing determination. The next morning they worked side by side at the woman's house. Some neighbors watched, unsure whether to approve or criticize. Together they mixed clay and straw in the yard, pressing it into the cracked boards from the outside. They shaped it smooth, blending old with new. It was not perfect, it was not a fortress. But when the wind rose that night, the draft lessened. Word traveled quickly after that. Soon she found herself answering more questions than she had expected. How thick should a mud wall be? How long must it dry? Would it last through heavy rain? She answered honestly. It required work, patience, attention. It was not magic. Yet even as interest grew, so did tension. The town council called a meeting at the small hall near the church. They spoke of building codes, of safety, of the appearance of the town. One man argued that if everyone began shaping homes from earth, the place would look unsettled, unfinished. Another worried about fire hazards, though mud does not burn the way wood does. She sat quietly in the back row, hands folded in her lap. When asked to speak, she rose slowly. Her voice was steady but calm. She reminded them that many houses had suffered in the last storm, that her fortress had not. She spoke of cost, of accessibility, of independence from distant lumber prices. She did not raise her tone. She did not plead. Silence followed her words. The council postponed any decision. They needed time, they said. Time to think. Outside the hall, neighbors divided into small groups, whispering. Some stood with her. Others shook their heads, uneasy about change. The young man who had once lingered near her door approached her again. He said he had been saving money to leave town, but now he wondered if leaving was the only way to build something new. She looked at him carefully. She saw in his eyes the same restless fire that had pushed her to start digging that first day. She told him that building does not always require leaving. Sometimes it requires staying and shaping what is already beneath your feet. Winter deepened, supplies grew scarcer. Wood prices rose after the storm damage across the county. Those who once scoffed at her $4 project began to speak the number with a different tone, some with envy, some with hope. Late one night, long after the town had gone quiet, she heard a sharp thud against her outer wall. She rose from bed and lit her lantern. Another thud followed, then the sound of something scraping against the clay surface. Her heart pounded, but her steps remained careful. She moved toward the door and listened. The wind was still. No branches lay near enough to strike the wall. She opened the door slowly and stepped into the cold darkness. The snow reflected pale moonlight. At the base of her fortress, near the western curve, she saw fresh marks carved into the outer layer. Not deep, but deliberate, lines cut with something sharp. Someone had tried to damage the wall. She knelt and touched the surface. The clay was scarred but not broken through. She could repair it by morning. The structure remained strong. Still, the message was clear. Not everyone wanted this fortress to stand. She rose and scanned the dark horizon. No movement, no footprints clear enough to follow. Only the vast quiet of winter fields. Inside again, she closed the door and rested her back against it. The lantern light flickered across the curved ceiling. She felt no regret, but she felt the weight of what she had started. A mud fortress built for $4 had already shaken more than wooden houses. It had unsettled habits, challenged pride, stirred questions about what was possible. She walked to the table and opened her notebook once more. The sketches of additional domes stared back at her. A larger gathering hall, a shared kitchen, a storage room built half into the ground for cooler temperatures in summer. She had imagined a small community of earth homes long before the first neighbor ever asked for help. Now the path ahead felt both closer and more dangerous. The scars on the outer wall would dry and vanish under a fresh layer of clay, but the tension in town would not disappear so easily. As she dipped her pen into ink and began outlining her next design, a new thought took shape. If one fortress could stand against storm and doubt, what might a row of them do? What would the town become if mud replaced lumber? If $4 became the start of something larger than anyone had expected? Outside, the night remained still. Inside, her plans grew bolder. And somewhere beyond the edge of her land, in the dark fields where frost clung to brittle grass, unseen eyes watched the faint glow from her windows and waited to see what she would build next. By morning, the cuts along the western wall looked smaller in the pale light, but they felt heavier in her mind. She mixed a fresh batch of clay before the frost fully lifted and pressed it firmly into the scars. Her fingers worked with steady care, smoothing the surface until the damage blended into the rest of the fortress. From a distance, no one would notice. Up close, she would always remember where someone had tried to weaken what she built. She did not speak of it in town that day. She wanted to see who might mention it first. At the general store, talk circled around rising lumber prices and a shipment that had been delayed by washed-out tracks near the next county. A few men grumbled about how expensive it had become to repair storm damage. One of them glanced at her and said nothing, but the look held a question. The woman whose kitchen wall they had patched approached her near the flour sacks. She asked, quiet but firm, whether the clay mixture could be used to build something larger than a repair, perhaps a small shed. Perhaps even a round room like the fortress, though not as tall. Her voice carried both hope and fear, as if she were asking permission to believe. She answered that it could be done, but only with patience. She warned that mud construction was not quick and not easy. It required time to dry and strength to layer properly. It required learning from mistakes. The woman nodded. She said she had time. That afternoon, the young man who once dreamed of leaving town appeared at the edge of her land carrying a borrowed shovel. He did not speak at first. He simply stood near the second ring of stones she had laid and looked at the open ground beyond it. He asked what she intended for that circle. She told him it would be larger than the first, a gathering place. A space for shared meals, meetings, perhaps even lessons on how to build with earth. She said she had written to a cousin in another state who had seen similar structures rise in dry regions. She hoped to gather more knowledge before expanding further. He hesitated before admitting that his father believed her project would bring trouble. Said the town council was under pressure from the largest lumber supplier in the county, a man whose business depended on people fearing alternatives. The supplier had already lost money after the storm when some families chose to patch with clay instead of buying new boards. She absorbed the information slowly. It made sense. Change rarely threatens only pride. It threatens profit. Over the next week, small shifts began to appear. A notice was posted near the well announcing a proposal for stricter building codes. Any new construction would require approval and inspection. Materials would need to meet certain standards, though the notice did not clearly define them. People murmured that the timing felt pointed. She attended the next council meeting again, this time with more neighbors at her side. The hall felt tighter, the air thicker. The council members spoke in careful tones about safety and uniformity. They claimed the new rules would protect families from unstable structures. When asked directly whether mud construction would be restricted, they avoided a clear answer. She stood when given the chance and asked a simple question. Had the fortress failed in the storm? Had it shown cracks beyond repair? Had it endangered anyone? The room remained quiet. No one could deny what they had seen with their own eyes. The lumber supplier himself sat near the front row that evening. His hands were broad and clean, his coat heavier than most in town. He did not speak during the meeting, but his gaze never left her. It was not open anger she saw there. It was calculation. Outside, snow continued to fall in slow waves. The second foundation ring remained half buried, waiting for the first layer of mud. She hesitated only a moment before beginning again. If the town council wished to question her methods, she would answer by building. Work on the larger dome drew attention quickly. The young man returned daily, helping to mix clay and carry straw. The woman with the patched kitchen brought her eldest child to stomp the mixture with bare feet, laughing when the mud splashed up their legs. A few others joined in quietly, offering an hour here or there. But not all support came kindly. One evening, as she walked home from the well, 2 older men stood near her fence line speaking loudly enough for her to hear. They said the town would look foolish if travelers passed through and saw a cluster of mud huts instead of proper American homes. They said progress meant boards and nails, not dirt and straw. They spoke of reputation and pride as if those words were made of timber. She kept walking, but the sting of their tone lingered longer than she expected. At night, she sometimes lay awake listening for more scraping against the walls. None came, yet the memory of that sound settled deep. She wondered who in town felt threatened enough to risk such petty damage. She did not want to suspect neighbors she had known since childhood. Still, doubt crept in like cold through a thin crack. The second dome began to rise, thicker at the base than the first. She adjusted her mixture, adding slightly more straw for tensile strength after noticing small surface fractures during drying. She experimented with a shallow trench around the outer ring to guide rainwater away. Each improvement felt like both defense and defiance. One morning, a wagon from outside the county rolled into town. It carried a pair of men dressed in coats too fine for farm work. They spoke with the council privately and left before dusk. Rumors spread that they represented an investment group interested in purchasing land along the edge of town for development. Some said they planned to build a grain warehouse. Others whispered about a rail extension. If the land near her fortress was sold and cleared, the quiet stretch of earth she relied on for clay and straw might change forever. The young man brought the news to her with worry written across his face. He said his father had been approached about selling a narrow strip that bordered her property. The offer was tempting. Winter had been costly. She felt the ground shift beneath her in a way no storm had caused. If heavy machinery rolled through, if the clay bed was dug up or covered, her plans would falter. The mud fortress might stand alone, surrounded not by fields but by structures built from lumber and iron. That evening she walked the perimeter of her land slowly. She pressed her hand against the cool wall of the first dome and then against the rising curve of the second. She imagined a future where children gathered inside the larger hall to learn skills rooted in the soil. She imagined affordable housing spreading outward, one circle at a time. But imagination is fragile when weighed against contracts and profit. Meanwhile, small successes continued to spark quiet rebellion. The woman who had asked about a shed completed a low, rounded storage space behind her house. It was not elegant, but it kept feed dry and cost almost nothing. Another neighbor patched his barn wall using clay instead of buying fresh planks. Each small project chipped away at the lumber supplier's control. Tension grew in subtle ways. Supplies that she ordered from town arrived late or damaged. The shovel she left outside once went missing and reappeared days later with a cracked handle. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be clearly blamed, yet enough to remind her that resistance was taking shape. One afternoon, she found the young man staring at the second dome with uncertainty clouding his usual energy. He admitted that his father had agreed to sell the strip of land after all. The contract would be signed within the month. Construction for the new development could begin by spring. She asked how he felt about it. He said he felt torn. The money would ease their burdens, yet he feared what the sale might bring: noise, dust, restrictions, perhaps even enforcement of those new building codes before her hall was complete. She placed a mud-covered hand on his shoulder and said change was not always chosen freely. Sometimes it arrived regardless. The question was how one met it. That night, the town council announced a final vote on the proposed building regulations to take place in 2 weeks. If passed, any new structure using non-traditional materials would require special permits and inspections, which could take months to approve. Work on her second dome might be halted before completion. The announcement divided the town more sharply than any storm. Families who had begun to consider earth construction felt cornered. Others argued that order must be maintained. The lumber supplier visited homes personally, reminding them of his long history of service to the community. She continued building through the cold, working by lantern light when days shortened. The second dome reached shoulder height. Its curved outline against the snowy field looked almost protective, as if shielding the first fortress from the coming battle. One evening, as she layered fresh clay, she noticed fresh wagon tracks cutting close to her property line. Deeper than usual, heavier, she followed them with her eyes toward the neighboring strip that had been sold. Stakes marked corners she did not recognize before. The land was already being measured. Inside the original fortress, she spread her notebook across the table and reviewed her plans. If regulations tightened, she might need to argue with more than logic. She might need proof, data, examples, perhaps even a demonstration that earth homes could meet safety standards better than thin wooden walls. She began drafting a letter to the county inspector, inviting him to visit before any vote was finalized. She described the thickness of the walls, the fire resistance of packed clay, the insulation properties that reduced reliance on costly fuel. She wrote carefully, aware that each word could influence the path ahead. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the distant sound of hammering from the newly marked land. It echoed faintly across the field, mixing with the steady crackle of her hearth fire. The mud fortress that had once been a symbol of quiet independence was becoming something else entirely. It stood at the center of a growing conflict between old ways and new control, between community resilience and outside profit. She closed her notebook and listened to the wind press against the curved walls. They did not shake. But beyond her land, forces were gathering that could not be patched with clay alone. And as winter edged closer to its harshest stretch, the unfinished dome beside her first fortress rose like a promise under threat, daring the town to decide whether it would stand with her or against what she had started. The hammering from the newly marked land did not stop with the wind. It grew louder as days passed, steady and sharp, echoing across the frozen field like a warning. Tall stakes turned into wooden frames. Wagons arrived carrying lumber stacked high in iron tools that glinted in pale winter light. The edge of town, once quiet and open, began to feel crowded and restless. She worked faster. The second dome had reached chest height, its thick mud walls layered carefully. Each section left to dry before the next was added. The young man arrived before sunrise most mornings now. His hands were cracked from cold and clay, but he said little about his father's land being sold. The tension sat between them without needing words. Neighbors who had quietly supported her began showing up more openly. The woman with the storage shed brought hot soup in a covered pot and stayed to smooth the outer layer with firm, practiced strokes. Two older men who once doubted her methods came with extra straw bundled under their arms. They did not apologize for their past remarks, but they mixed and stomped alongside everyone else. It started to feel less like her project alone and more like something the town itself was shaping. Still, the council vote loomed close. Notices were pinned in the store window and outside the church. The proposed building codes were printed in small, careful script. Any new construction using non-traditional materials would require formal approval, inspection fees, and documented proof of structural safety. For a large company with money, that meant paperwork. For people building with mud and hope, it meant delay and doubt. The lumber supplier began speaking more boldly in public. He stood near the post office one afternoon and reminded passers-by that tradition had carried the town through generations. He warned that experimental housing could lower property value and invite ridicule from surrounding counties. He said no one wanted their home compared to a barn or a hut. She heard about the speech but did not attend. Instead, she focused on finishing the outer layer of the second dome before the council vote. If it stood nearly complete, halting it would be harder. Snow melted for a brief stretch when an early thaw passed through. The ground turned soft and heavy. Some worried the wet soil would weaken the new dome's base. She walked the perimeter carefully, inspecting for signs of shifting. The stone foundation held firm, the trench guiding water away just as she had planned. She made small adjustments, deepening the drainage channel and packing the base tighter. Each test felt like both practice and proof. One evening, the county inspector responded to her letter. He arrived in a plain coat, notebook in hand, boots caked with travel mud. He walked slowly around the original fortress, pressing against the wall, measuring thickness, tapping at different points. He asked detailed questions about the mixture ratio, drying time, and maintenance. She answered calmly, showing him her own records. Inside, he examined the hearth and the smoke vent, noting how evenly heat seemed to settle. He stepped back outside and stood silently for a long moment, studying the curved shape against the gray sky. He did not offer praise. He did not offer criticism. He simply said he would submit his observations to the council before the vote. The days leading up to the meeting felt tight and stretched thin at the same time. Work on the neighboring development moved quickly. A tall wooden frame rose where open field had been. The sound of sawing and hammering filled the air from dawn until dusk. Some families welcomed the promise of new jobs. Others worried about rising prices and changing ways. Late one afternoon, she found fresh footprints circling the second dome, not from helpers. These steps were heavier, spaced farther apart. The surface of the drying mud bore shallow dents, as if someone had pressed down deliberately before it had fully hardened. Her jaw tightened. It was not enough to collapse the wall, but it would require repair. She called the young man over, and together they smoothed the marks before they deepened into cracks. Neither of them spoke about who might have done it. The silence said enough. That night she did not sleep easily. She rose twice to check the outer walls, lantern in hand. The fortress stood quiet under moonlight. The second dome cast a larger shadow now, protective yet unfinished. She realized how much she had come to rely on the strength of these curved walls, not just for shelter, but for resolve. The morning of the council vote arrived cold and bright. Frost clung to fence rails and wagon wheels. The hall filled quickly, more crowded than any meeting she could remember. Farmers, shopkeepers, mothers with infants wrapped tight in blankets. Even the traveling preacher returned, sitting near the back. She took a seat beside the woman whose shed had been built from mud. The young man stood near the wall, arms folded. Across the room, the lumber supplier adjusted his gloves and waited. The council members read the proposal aloud once more. Words like safety, compliance, regulation, and community standard echoed against the wooden beams of the hall. When they opened the floor for comment, voices rose quickly. One neighbor spoke of how the mud fortress had survived the worst storm in years without damage. Another argued that tradition should not block innovation. A third insisted that change must be measured and cautious. The debate felt less about mud and lumber and more about control and fear. When her turn came, she stood slowly. She did not raise her voice. She spoke of affordable housing, of energy efficiency, of independence from rising lumber costs. She spoke of the knowledge she had gathered and shared freely. She reminded them that the fortress cost $4 in purchased materials and stood stronger than many expensive homes after the storm. Then she paused and looked around the room. She said she was not asking the town to abandon wood entirely. She was asking for room to build differently. For permission to shape earth into shelter without being buried in paperwork designed for factories and warehouses. The silence that followed felt heavy and uncertain. Before the council could begin voting, the doors at the back of the hall opened abruptly. A gust of wind swept in, carrying fine snow. A boy from the edge of town stood there, breathless, eyes wide. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another. There had been a collapse at the new development site. A portion of the tall wooden frame had given way under shifting ground made soft by the thaw. No one was badly hurt, but the structure had fallen crooked and unstable. Murmurs rippled through the room. The lumber supplier's face tightened, though he tried to hide it. Some council members exchanged uneasy glances. The timing felt sharp, almost cruel in its irony. Without thinking, she stepped toward the door. Several others followed. They moved together across the field toward the construction site. The half-built wooden frame leaned at a dangerous angle, beams twisted, nails pulled loose where the ground had sunk beneath one corner. Workers stood nearby, frustrated and shaken. The soil there had not been reinforced deeply enough to handle the weight after the thaw. The foundation trench was shallow and uneven. She knelt near the base and pressed her hand into the damp earth. It felt loose, unprepared. She stood and looked toward her own land where the rounded domes rose steady and thick. No one said it out loud, but the comparison hung between them. Back at the hall, the council postponed the vote until repairs at the site could be assessed. The delay did not settle anything. It sharpened everything. Work on the development slowed while engineers were consulted. Rumors spread that costs were rising fast. Some investors were reconsidering the scale of the project. The strip of land sold by the young man's father now sat cluttered with half-finished lumber and idle tools. Meanwhile, the second dome on her property reached nearly full height. Only the upper curve and roofline remained incomplete. The sense of urgency pushed her to work late into the evenings despite the cold. Neighbors rotated shifts to help, bringing lanterns and blankets. One evening, as they layered mud along the upper arch, a strong wind swept across the field again. Dark clouds gathered low and heavy. The air carried that charged stillness that comes before a hard storm. She felt it in her bones. The young man glanced toward the development site where the weakened wooden frame still stood partially upright. He said if the storm hit hard, it might not hold. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. She looked at the second dome, at the still damp upper section not yet fully cured. If rain came heavy now, it could damage days of work. The outer layer needed more time to set. The first drops fell sharp and cold. Helpers scrambled to cover the fresh mud with tarps. She moved quickly, pressing edges down with stones. Wind tugged at the fabric, threatening to tear it free. Across the field, a loud crack echoed as one of the temporary support beams at the development site snapped under pressure. Rain intensified, drumming against the curved walls of her original fortress. Water streamed down the surface in clean lines. The second dome held firm beneath its coverings, but the unfinished top trembled slightly under the force of the wind. She stood between the two structures, rain soaking through her coat, watching as lightning flashed against the dark sky. The development frame swayed again, nails screeching as wood shifted against wood. Neighbors shouted over the storm, some running toward their homes, others toward the unstable construction site to secure what they could. The council vote, the building codes, the question of affordable housing and mud construction all felt suspended in that wild moment. Nature did not care for regulations or profit. It tested everything equally. Another crack split the air. A beam from the development frame broke free and slammed into the ground with a heavy thud. She turned back toward her nearly completed dome. The tarp strained but held. The thick mud walls beneath them felt steady, grounded deep in the earth she had shaped with her own hands. Rain poured harder, blurring the line between her land and the construction site beyond. As thunder rolled overhead and wind howled across the field, the town watched in tense silence, waiting to see which structures would stand when morning came and which would fall. Morning came slowly, gray light pushing through heavy clouds as the storm drifted east. The wind had calmed to a low whistle across the open fields. Doors creaked open one by one as neighbors stepped outside to face what the night had done. She stood in the doorway of her original mud fortress, boots planted firm, breath steady. The tarp still clung to the upper curve of the second dome. Water had pooled along the shallow trench she had carved, but it had flowed away from the base just as planned. The thick mud walls, layered with patience and care, remained solid. Not a single section had collapsed. Across the field, the wooden development site told a different story. The tall frame that once stood proud now leaned broken against itself. Several beams had fallen completely, scattered across the soaked ground. Nails glinted among splintered boards. Workers moved cautiously around the wreckage, shaking their heads. The shallow foundation trench had widened under the heavy rain, and the weight of the structure had proven too much. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Neighbors gathered between the two sites, silent at first. The woman with the mud shed stood beside her, eyes scanning the sturdy curves of the dome. The young man stepped closer to the fallen wooden frame, then turned back toward the earth homes with a slow, thoughtful nod. The lumber supplier arrived not long after, his coat pulled tight against the cold. He walked the damaged site with stiff steps, speaking quietly to the workers. His confidence seemed thinner than before. When he glanced toward the mud fortress and the rising dome, his expression held something new. It was not anger, it was recognition. The council members called for an emergency meeting that same afternoon. This time the hall felt different. There was less arguing and more listening. The storm had done what debates could not. It had offered proof. The county inspector stood near the front and read from his notes. He confirmed that the mud fortress met structural safety standards. He spoke about the thickness of the walls, the stability of the foundation, and the natural insulation that made it energy efficient. He acknowledged that while earth construction required proper technique, it was not inferior. In some ways, it was stronger. The council chair cleared his throat and looked around the room. He admitted that the proposed building codes had been drafted with traditional lumber construction in mind. He suggested revisions that would allow alternative building materials, including mud, clay, and other natural resources, as long as basic safety principles were followed. Murmurs of agreement moved through the hall. When the vote finally came, it was not close. The revised building codes passed with support for non-traditional construction. Permits would still be required, but the process would be fair and accessible. There would be no hidden barriers aimed at stopping innovation. Relief spread across faces that had been tight with tension for weeks. Outside, word traveled quickly. By sunset, small groups gathered near her land once more. This time they did not come to mock or to question. They came to ask how to begin. She stood beside the nearly completed second dome, hands still marked with dried clay, and answered patiently. She explained the importance of choosing the right soil, testing its clay content by rolling it into a ribbon. She described mixing straw for strength and layering walls slowly to prevent cracks. She spoke about drainage trenches and wide foundations. She emphasized patience over speed. What had once been her private experiment was becoming a shared effort. The young man approached her later that evening with a quiet smile. His father had reconsidered part of the land sale. After seeing the damage and rising costs at the development site, the investors were negotiating smaller plans. A portion of the strip might remain untouched. His father was thinking about using that land for a cluster of affordable mud homes instead of selling it all. The idea felt bold and hopeful. Over the following weeks, the second dome was completed. Its upper curve was smoothed and sealed with a fine outer layer that shed water easily. Inside, the space opened wide and welcoming. Neighbors helped install simple wooden benches and a long shared table. Light filtered through carefully placed vents, casting soft patterns on the earthen floor. They held the first community gathering there on a clear afternoon. No grand speeches, no ribbons cut. Just neighbors sitting together in a space built from their own hands and local materials. Children ran along the curved walls, laughing at how their voices echoed gently. The woman who had first patched her kitchen wall spoke about how warm her home had stayed through the last cold snap. Another neighbor shared that his feed storage shed had kept dry despite heavy rain. The young man announced plans to start building a small round home on his family's remaining land, using the techniques he had learned. The lumber supplier attended the gathering quietly. He did not apologize, but he approached her near the doorway and spoke in a low, respectful tone. He admitted that he had underestimated the strength of mud construction. He said his business might begin stocking tools and materials useful for earth building as well as lumber. Adaptation, he said, was part of survival. She nodded, understanding that change did not have to destroy what came before. It could reshape it. As spring arrived, the field that once held only her single mud fortress began to change. One small dome rose near the woman's house, serving as a workshop. Another took shape on the young man's land, its foundation deeper and wider as he had learned. Each structure carried slight differences, reflecting the hands that built it, yet all shared the same thick, curved walls and simple strength. Travelers passing through town slowed their wagons to look. Some asked questions, a few took notes. The story of a woman who built a mud fortress for $4 and sparked a shift in affordable housing began to spread beyond county lines. She continued keeping her notebook, though now it filled with shared ideas and improvements suggested by others. Someone experimented with adding lime for greater water resistance. Another suggested building partially into a hillside for natural temperature control. The knowledge grew, rooted in experience rather than theory. One evening, she stood at the edge of her land and looked across the field. Where once there had been open dirt and doubt, now there were curved shapes rising from the earth like natural extensions of the ground itself. Smoke drifted gently from several vents. Children's laughter carried on the breeze. The conflict that had once felt sharp and dividing had softened into cooperation. The town had not abandoned wood entirely, nor had it become a settlement of only mud homes. Instead, it had found balance. People chose what suited their needs and means. Affordable housing was no longer a distant idea, but a practical option. She thought back to the first day she pressed her palm into the soil and began shaping that initial circle. The laughter, the whispers, the scars carved into her wall. All of it felt far away now, though she knew the lessons remained close. Resilience was not loud, it was steady. It layered itself over time, just like the mud walls she had built. Each challenge had added strength rather than weakness. The council later invited her to help draft guidelines for alternative construction, ensuring safety without stifling creativity. She accepted, not for recognition but to protect the path that had opened. She wanted others, especially those with little money, to know they could build something lasting with what lay beneath their feet. On the anniversary of the first storm, the town held a small celebration in the large dome. Lanterns hung along the curved walls. Neighbors shared food and stories. The young man, now building his own home, thanked her publicly for showing that leaving was not the only way forward. She felt her cheeks warm at the attention but smiled anyway. As night fell and the gathering slowly dispersed, she remained inside the dome for a quiet moment. The thick mud walls held the warmth of the day. The space felt alive with memory and effort. She placed her hand against the surface and felt gratitude. Neighbors had called it crazy when she began. They had laughed at the idea of a mud fortress built for $4. They had doubted its strength, its purpose, its place in their town. Now, the curved shapes rising from the earth stood as proof that sometimes the simplest materials carry the greatest power. Affordable housing, sustainable building, energy efficiency, and community resilience were no longer distant ideas. They were living around her. She stepped outside and looked at the original fortress glowing softly under lantern light. It no longer stood alone. The field that once held only skepticism now carried possibility. The town that once feared change had found pride in innovation rooted in tradition. She drew a slow breath of cool night air and closed the door gently behind her, knowing the story that began with $4 and a stubborn dream had grown into something far larger than a single mud wall. And in the quiet strength of those earthen domes, she found not just shelter, but home.